It was the year 1240. The land trembled under the shadow of the Mongol horde, their fierce hooves thundering across the plains. The Rus, once a proud and unified force, had been broken by years of fragmentation and internal strife. Yet, despite the odds, whispers of defiance began to spread. In the east, Batu Khan's forces were advancing like a relentless storm, sweeping through cities, burning villages, and leaving nothing but ash in their wake. It seemed unstoppable. The Mongols, a force of nature, had already shattered the might of the Hungarians, the Poles, and now they set their sights on the heart of Russia. It was not just a battle for land, it was the very soul of the Rus that hung in the balance. In the small villages along the Dnieper River, the people spoke in hushed tones of a different kind of hope. An ancient river that had seen the rise and fall of empires, it now stood as the last line of defense for the scattered Russian forces. It was here, on this very river, that fate would soon decide the future of the Rus. The Russian princes, fractured and divided, still clung to power, each in their own isolated kingdom. Many had already lost hope, some already prepared to surrender to the Mongols. But a few, a handful of leaders, knew that the survival of their people depended on one thing: unity. And in that unity, a single man would rise, though few knew his name yet. For now, the battlefield was silent, like the calm before a storm. The wind blew softly across the Dnieper, rustling the trees along its banks. But the peace was deceiving. In the distance, Batu Khan's army advanced steadily, like a tidal wave drawing ever closer. Soon, there would be no more time for waiting. The Rus would either face annihilation or rise to defy the Mongol invaders. If you enjoyed this epic retelling of the battle on the Dnieper, be sure to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more fascinating historical stories. Let us know your thoughts and which moment from the battle resonated with you the most in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinion. Batu Khan's army moved with a terrifying precision. They were not mere invaders. They were the embodiment of destruction itself. For months, they had carved their way across Eastern Europe, leaving behind only bloodied fields and smoldering ruins. Entire cities had fallen beneath the weight of Mongol siege tactics, their people slaughtered or enslaved. The Mongols were swift, merciless, and seemingly unstoppable. Batu Khan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan, was a leader unlike any the world had seen before. His eyes were cold, as though he had seen the heavens themselves bleed. His army was vast, made up of thousands of horsemen and warriors, each one trained from childhood in the art of war. The Mongols did not fight like others. They were masters of the open plains, their cavalry striking like lightning, fast and unpredictable. Rumors of their brutality had already spread like wildfire. Towns and villages fell one after another, their defenders no match for the Mongol might. It was said that no one had ever resisted them long enough to cause even a fleeting hesitation. As Batu Khan's forces approached the Dnieper River, the Rus knew they had no time to waste. The river, once a natural barrier, now seemed like a prison. The Mongols, however, had no fear of water. They had crossed mighty rivers before, their horsemen skimming across on rafts, using their speed and agility to outmaneuver anyone who dared oppose them. But what Batu Khan did not know was that the Rus were not as weak as they appeared. While their armies had been divided and scattered, whispers of a plan began to circulate through the land. The Mongols thought they would face an easy conquest, unaware that a few men, with one singular vision, were beginning to form a force that would surprise them all. The Rus had not forgotten how to fight. Though their past victories seemed distant, the courage of their ancestors still burned bright within their hearts. They would not surrender without a fight, no matter the cost. As the Mongol army drew closer, the Rus leaders, still fractured and mistrustful of one another, began to realize one undeniable truth. They would either unite or face extinction. The storm was coming, and it would be unlike any battle the world had ever seen. On the banks of the Dnieper, the fate of the Rus was about to be written in blood. In the midst of the chaos, when it seemed as though the Mongol storm would sweep all before it, a figure emerged from the shadows of history, a strategist whose name would echo through the annals of time. This man, whose brilliance was hidden beneath the surface of fractured principalities, was destined to change the course of the battle for the Rus. He was not a prince of great lineage or a warlord with an army of his own. He was a general, a leader whose skill in war was matched only by his ability to read the land and his enemies. His name was Alexander Nevsky, a man who had already proven himself on smaller battlefields, but had yet to face the true might of the Mongol horde. Alexander had not always been the unifying force of the Rus. In fact, in his early years, he was often embroiled in the petty squabbles and rivalries that plagued the Russian principalities. But he understood the true nature of power. It was not about titles or wealth. It was about the land, the people, and the will to defend them at all costs. As Batu Khan's forces closed in, Alexander saw an opportunity that no one else had dared to imagine. The Dnieper River was not just a boundary between territories. It was a weapon. It could be both a shield and a sword. The Mongols, in their overconfidence, believed they could cross it with ease. But Alexander knew better. The Dnieper could become a trap that would turn the tide of battle in favor of the Rus. He gathered a small but loyal band of commanders and began to craft a plan. It was a bold strategy, relying on speed, deception, and the geography of the land. The Mongols, so accustomed to their swift cavalry, would be caught off guard by the Russian defense, which would not stand in direct confrontation, but would strike when and where the Mongols least expected it. But Alexander was not blind to the challenges ahead. The Rus were not a unified force. They were fractured by years of infighting and distrust. In order for his plan to succeed, he would need to convince the scattered princes and commanders to set aside their differences. He would need to make them understand that their survival and the survival of their people depended on a single moment of unity. As he met with the Russian leaders, many were skeptical. Some questioned his vision, others doubted his ability to lead a fractured army against the might of the Mongols. Yet in his eyes, they saw a fire that spoke of something more than hope. It spoke of survival. There were no guarantees. But one thing was clear. If Alexander could pull off this plan, the Rus would not only survive, they would send a message to the Mongols, one they would not soon forget. The time to act was fast approaching. As the Mongol army advanced with unwavering confidence, Alexander's quiet determination began to shape the future of the Rus. The Dnieper River, a lifeblood of the Rus, had borne witness to the rise and fall of kingdoms, the ebb and flow of countless armies. Its waters were deep and swift, twisting through the land like an artery, dividing the Russian heartlands from the east. But now, it was more than just a river. It was a battlefield. For the Rus, the Dnieper was both their salvation and their weapon. As the Mongol army closed in, their scouts reported that the river would pose no significant obstacle to Batu Khan's advance. The Mongols had crossed rivers before, their horsemen skilled in navigating the waters on makeshift rafts. Batu Khan, confident in the superiority of his forces, dismissed the Dnieper's potential as anything more than a minor inconvenience. But Alexander Nevsky knew better. He had spent years studying the land, its rivers and forests, its valleys and hills, learning every trick the terrain had to offer. Unlike the Mongols, who were trained for open battle on the plains, the Rus had long been shaped by their rivers, forests, and harsh winters. They were a people who understood the art of ambush, of using the natural world to their advantage. The Dnieper, with its swift currents and its network of hidden channels, would be a natural defense, but only if used correctly. Alexander had a vision of a riverbed transformed into a death trap, one that would slow the Mongol cavalry, forcing them into narrow, treacherous passages where their mobility would be hindered. It was here, on these hidden shores, that the Rus could strike. As the Russian army assembled along the river, a sense of quiet anticipation hung in the air. The soldiers, though still divided and uncertain, had been rallied by Alexander's vision. They knew this would be their final stand. The Mongols were coming, and they would either face the full force of Batu Khan or find some way to strike first to turn the tide of history in their favor. The Russian general issued orders for his troops to begin positioning themselves along the riverbanks. The terrain, though difficult, offered the perfect opportunity for an ambush. The Rus knew the land like no other. They would hide in the forested edges of the river, waiting for the Mongols to make their move. The river was their shield, but it would soon become their sword. The Rus would not face the Mongols on open ground, where the might of their cavalry would have free rein. Instead, they would lure the Mongols into the narrow paths, where their advantage could be stripped away by the very geography that had once been their enemy. Alexander's plan was daring, but it was their only chance. As the river flowed quietly beneath them, the soldiers of the Rus prepared for the battle that would define their future. The Mongols, still unaware of the trap set before them, marched closer, confident that victory was already within their grasp. But the Rus were ready. The Dnieper was not just a river. It was their weapon, their hope, their final stand. And as the first sounds of the Mongol advance echoed in the distance, the river began to stir with the promise of something greater than survival. The Rus were not an army, but a collection of fractured forces, each prince commanding his own territory, each with his own agenda. For years, infighting and division had weakened them. But now, at the Dnieper River, the stakes had never been higher. The Mongol tide was rising, and there was no more room for petty rivalries. The Russian soldiers who stood on the riverbanks were not the best equipped or most seasoned warriors. Many were peasants, farmers who had never wielded a sword before this war. Their armor was mismatched, cobbled together from the remnants of fallen comrades and salvaged from the wreckage of previous battles. And yet, despite their ragtag appearance, there was a fire in their eyes, something more than desperation. It was the will to survive, to fight not just for their land, but for their families, their homes, and their way of life. The Mongol threat was unlike anything they had ever faced. Batu Khan's army was vast, made up of expert horsemen, archers, and seasoned warriors. The Rus had no hope of matching the Mongols in numbers or strength. But Alexander Nevsky, despite the odds, had managed to convince the Russian leaders to unite for this single moment. It was not just a battle for territory. It was a battle for their very existence. As the Mongols advanced, the Russian forces scrambled to position themselves along the river. There was no time to waste, no time to reconsider. The Russian princes, some still skeptical, others reluctant, watched nervously as the army they had assembled was scattered and unprepared. They could see the Mongols approaching, their endless columns of soldiers stretching toward the horizon. There was no turning back now. Alexander knew this battle would be the end of either their dreams of freedom or their lives. The river, once a barrier, had become their only hope. The night before the battle, the air was thick with tension as the Russian leaders gathered under the cover of darkness. The Dnieper River, once a natural boundary, now stood as their final barrier against the Mongol horde. The council assembled in a dimly lit tent, a quiet hum of anxious voices filling the room. It was the first time in years that the scattered Russian princes had been forced to set aside their differences. But even now, there were doubts. Alexander Nevsky stood at the head of the council, his presence commanding attention. He was not a prince by birthright, yet the weight of leadership rested on his shoulders. His eyes, calm and calculating, swept over the room, gauging the tension. The princes, some skeptical, some resentful, were far from united. But they knew the stakes. Tomorrow, the Mongols would advance. If they did not stand together, their land would fall. "We have no time for debate," Alexander said, his voice steady but firm. "Tomorrow, we fight as one or we perish. The Mongols will show no mercy. If we fail, we lose everything." The words hit hard. It was the truth none wanted to face, but all knew deep down. Prince Mstislav of Chernigov, whose support was crucial, crossed his arms and leaned forward. "What is your plan, Nevsky?" he asked, his tone both curious and cautious. Alexander laid out a map of the Dnieper before them, tracing his fingers along the river's winding course. His strategy was simple but bold. "We will use the river's natural flow to create a choke point," he explained. "The Mongols rely on mobility, but they cannot fight in narrow spaces. We will lure them into these channels and strike when they are vulnerable." Murmurs rippled through the council. It was a dangerous gamble, but the only one that could turn the tide. The princes, wary of trusting Alexander's vision, nonetheless saw no other choice. One by one, they nodded, their reluctance giving way to the gravity of the situation. "Then we stand together," Alexander said, the weight of the decision settling over them. The council disbanded as the leaders made their way out of the tent, their faces set with determination. Tomorrow would be a battle not just for survival, but for the future of the Rus. The dawn of battle was nearing, but the night before, it held an eerie calm. The air was heavy with the tension of what was to come. The river flowed relentlessly, a constant reminder of the path they had chosen. The Dnieper, once a mere natural boundary, was now the heart of the Rus' final stand. Alexander Nevsky walked along the riverbank, his eyes scanning the water's surface. His mind was sharp, filled with the calculations of the coming hours. The plan was set, but in his heart there remained an unease. He knew the Mongols were ruthless, and while the river might slow their advance, it would not guarantee victory. The Rus had only one chance to make their stand. The camp was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. Soldiers, who had been nervous and uncertain just days ago, were now preparing themselves. They moved with purpose, their faces set in grim determination. They had heard Alexander's speech, felt the weight of the plan, but each man carried his own fear and resolve. In the camps of the Russian princes, the air was thick with unspoken words. The leaders had set aside their rivalry for a single moment, but unity was fragile. Alexander's plan was their only hope, but there were no guarantees. They could not afford to falter. The Mongols, relentless and feared across the land, would not show mercy. By the river, the silence stretched long. Some soldiers prayed, others simply stared at the flowing water, lost in their thoughts. No words were needed. They all understood what tomorrow would bring. The battle would begin at first light, and there was no turning back. The river, their greatest ally, would be both their weapon and their shield. The Russ's forces were ready, or as ready as they could be. They had no choice now but to trust in Alexander's vision and the strength of their unity. As the night deepened, all they could do was wait for the dawn. The first light of dawn broke over the Dnieper, casting a pale glow over the river's surface. The silence of the night was shattered by the thundering sound of hooves. Batu Khan's Mongol forces, vast and unstoppable, had arrived at the river's edge. Their dark columns stretched as far as the eye could see, and the air hummed with the promise of destruction. At the Russian camp, the soldiers stood at attention, their hearts pounding in their chests. Their armor clinked as they prepared. But it wasn't the armor or the weapons that weighed on them. It was the knowledge that this battle would determine the future of their people. For many, it was the first time they would face such an enemy, and doubt crept into their minds. Could they truly stop the Mongols? Alexander Nevsky stood at the forefront, his eyes fixed on the enemy's approach. His plan was in motion. The Mongols were confident, their cavalry out in full force, unaware of the traps set along the river. The Rus forces were strategically hidden along the banks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first wave of Mongol soldiers, unaware of the narrow passages ahead, began to cross the river. The horses splashed into the water, their powerful bodies cutting through the current. Batu Khan's forces pushed forward with the speed and efficiency that had earned them their reputation. But they were about to learn that the Rus had prepared for this moment. As the Mongol vanguard crossed into the river's narrow channels, Alexander's signal rang out. The Rus, hidden in the shadows, emerged from the forest with terrifying force. The ambush was swift, ruthless. The Mongols, momentarily disoriented by the sudden assault, struggled to regroup. The narrow channels of the river, once thought to be an advantage, now worked against the Mongols, their horses unable to maneuver. The battle erupted in chaos, the air filled with the sounds of clashing swords and the screams of men. The Rus fought with a fury they had never known, pushing the Mongols back with every swing of their blades. The Dnieper, once a quiet river, was now a battlefield drenched in blood. The battle raged on the banks of the Dnieper, a fierce and violent storm of steel and blood. The Mongols, taken off guard by the ambush, struggled to regroup. Their cavalry, usually so fast and deadly, was now confined to the narrow river channels, unable to use their greatest strength, mobility. It was here, in this crucial moment, that Alexander Nevsky's plan began to bear fruit. With every strike, the Rus pressed forward, their numbers bolstered by the fear and desperation that coursed through their veins. The Mongols, usually the ones dictating the pace of the battle, were now the ones on the defensive. The narrowness of the river and the dense forests around them limited their movement, and the Rus were exploiting every advantage. Batu Khan's forces were not used to this kind of warfare. The river's current, strong and unforgiving, made it even more difficult for them to fight back. Horses stumbled, soldiers slipped, and the Mongols, who had once seemed invincible, began to falter. The once unshakable confidence of Batu Khan's army was being shattered by the relentless ferocity of the Rus. In the midst of the chaos, Alexander's eyes remained calm. He could see the tide turning, could feel the momentum shifting in favor of his men. The Mongols, disoriented and trapped in the narrow channels of the river, were struggling to regain control. The Rus were relentless, their fury fueled not just by the will to survive, but by a deep, unwavering determination to protect their land. Alexander's heart raced, but his mind stayed sharp. The battle was not over, but the Mongols were starting to break. If the Rus could hold the line just a little longer, victory would be within reach. But he knew that nothing was certain in war. They had gained the advantage, but the Mongols would not surrender easily. As the hours dragged on, the battle began to take its toll on both sides. The river, once a source of promise for the Rus, had now become a battlefield soaked in the blood of men and horses. But for Alexander Nevsky, it was clear. The Mongols were faltering. The Rus forces, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with an intensity born from their desperation. The narrow river channels, once thought a disadvantage, had become a perfect trap. The Mongol cavalry, trapped between the river's banks and the fierce resistance of the Rus, struggled to maintain order. Horses, unable to maneuver in the cramped spaces, were falling under the weight of arrows and sword strikes. Batu Khan, watching from a distance, could feel the shift in the wind. His army, so used to sweeping through nations with little resistance, was finally facing something different. The Rus, though vastly outnumbered, were using their land, their river, and their willpower in ways the Mongols hadn't expected. But the battle was far from over. The Mongols, though disoriented, were not defeated. Their generals shouted orders, attempting to rally their soldiers and push back against the relentless Russian assault. The river had slowed them, but it had not broken them completely. The Mongol forces began to regroup, trying to form a new line of defense, but the momentum had already begun to shift. As Alexander watched, he knew that if the Rus were to win this battle, it would not be by force alone. It would be through sheer willpower, the kind of strength that came from the deep, unwavering connection to their land, their people, and their culture. The Mongols might have been fierce warriors, but the Rus had something they could not take away: the spirit of a nation fighting for its very survival. If you enjoyed this epic retelling of the battle on the Dnieper, be sure to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more fascinating historical stories. Let us know your thoughts and which moment from the battle resonated with you the most in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinion.